Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Sometimes the best way to find a living is to stay right where you are and study with UAS online. Career-specific distance programs from the University of Alaska Southeast are the fastest way to increase your earning power.
We connect all over the world.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 18th of October. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. You can do that by going to weather.gov/Alaska or calling us on the Alaska Weather Information Line at 800-472-0391. As always, I'm happy to help you find your way through our newer websites that we rolled out earlier this summer. nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov is a good way to reach the TV team, or if you'd like to just email me, I'm happy to look at your photos from all across Alaska. I'd love to show them on the show too, so send a few to me tonight. david.snyder@noaa.gov. Here's a look at what's going on as far as weather show times. Unchanged in the last couple weeks, so that's great news. Look at the ARC system, of course. You're watching us live at 5:30. Same for KUAC, channel 9.4 on UAF TV at 5:30 there in the Fairbanks area. And 360 North, there will be a few changes throughout this week, thanks to the convention at the AFN convention, of course, which is so very important. We want to make sure that you're seeing it there on 360 North. We're going to scoot the Alaska Weather Show back as soon as that coverage ends. You'll see Alaska Weather. So it's not canceled this week on 360 North. It's just going to be a little bit later on in the evening, so about 9:30 or so. So check your local listings. Those are up to date. They will have the very latest times there that those are changes for just this week. So check on 360 North if you're found your way over there for Alaska Weather, and you will see the show. It just might be a little bit different and later on in the evening. Alaska Weather, of course, is always on Alaska Public Media at 5 o'clock the following morning and on YouTube at AKwx TV. You can find a link from the National Weather Service site as well. Now, as you're out in southeast Alaska, no doubt you've heard that some stronger winds are coming in. We now have a high wind warning for the southern outer coast across the eastern Gulf there for southeastern Alaska. That includes Craig and Klawock. We're talking about winds coming up over storm force there, probably looking at winds around the 60-mile-an-hour range with some higher gusts possible. It's going to come up quickly overnight and early into tomorrow morning, and then start to diminish as we head through the midday hours. So a high wind warning is in effect for you around Craig and Klawock and from the Dixon entrance up toward Cape Salisbury there. So watch for some stronger winds there, mainly on the outer coast. Now the rest of southeast will be dealing with some strong and gusty winds throughout the day, but it's going to be the south and eastern coast that really takes it at first a little bit harder than everyone else. Here's a look at the satellite picture, and putting this in motion, you can see we have a pretty strong low across the western Gulf of Alaska. This has got some stronger winds wrapping into the front edge of this, and as that front or the leading edge of that weather change works its way across southeastern Alaska, those winds will come up fairly quickly as we head into tonight and early tomorrow morning. Behind that, it's cold enough for snow across the Alaska Peninsula, and some areas there have seen some light snowfall today. Nothing too substantial as far as we understand it. Kodiak had a little bit of snow this morning, as did some parts of Anchorage and the Kenai Peninsula. Most areas weren't talking about any significant accumulations, but places like Girdwood did manage to pick up a couple inches late last night and early this morning. Now across southeast, again, a fairly mild day today, a little bit of rain here and there, but by and large, the bigger weather is still moving your way. Here's a look at the surface chart, and the low pressure system's down to 975 millibars there. Again, rain out ahead of that, and then a large swath of drier air, but notice how the millibars plotted here, or the contours, all kind of scrunched together there. The tighter they are, as we always say, the faster the wind is flowing, and that packed pressure pattern is working its way into southeastern Alaska. Try saying that 5 times fast as well. A look up north across the Bering Strait. Colder air is poised and ready to drop further southward. As if the snow in the southern parts of Alaska wasn't sign enough, it does look like there's another round of colder air that's going to try and work in on the back side of this. High pressure sitting across the eastern Beaufort Sea at 1,015 millibars is trying to prevent that from happening in a great and quick way. Low pressure will deepen tonight across the western Gulf. That's at 974 millibars during the overnight hours. And here comes the first wave. A warm front lifting northward will compress that pressure pattern across southeastern Alaska, the northern Gulf, and all the way into Bristol Bay. So the winds will be coming up not only for southeastern Alaska, but also for south central and Shelikof Strait. Again, storm force winds expected there and on the eastern side of Kodiak Island, not to mention some areas around southern southeast. So again, gales at very least and probably some stronger winds in that region. Now, as we're looking at the eastern interior, watch for a few snow showers there on the north side of the Alaska Range, as well as the eastern and central Beaufort Sea coast, all the way down the Chukchi Sea into parts of the Bering Strait. Out west, it would be remiss to not mention another system trying to work its way in from the west, but if you look carefully here, there's a ridge of high pressure that stretches all the way up into eastern Siberia, so that's kind of slowing that down for right now. However, one system moves out of the way, we'll be watching what the next one does, and of course, being fall, there is certainly more to come behind that. Low pressure across the northern Gulf then drops to 990 millibars. The main system moves even further southward to about 978 millibars. And now we've got an occluded front by Wednesday that's creeping in on the southeastern coast. Notice how the pressure pattern has relaxed already in that 12-hour period. So the worst of it, as far as wind goes for southeast, will likely be in the early morning hours till midday, and then things should start to subside a little bit more as we get into the afternoon. Maybe not completely, but things will improve by late day. And the higher terrain, snow showers are expected all the way wrapping into the Copper River Basin and Lake Iliamna in the southern Alaska and western Alaska Range, I should say. And north of the Alaska Range, we also have some lingering snow showers there, and it might be warm enough up around the western tip of the Seward Peninsula to St. Lawrence Island and the Chukchi Coast up toward Point Hope and maybe even Wainwright, that rain may mix with snow in those locations. By and large, most of Alaska will remain fairly dry, although there will be more clouds as we go into the midweek. Here's a look at Thursday, and the low pressure system that's causing all of the wind is still there, but it's wrapped its way back to about 986 millibars and working south of Haida Gwaii. The occlusion will mainly hang south and east of southeastern Alaska, but we still have a wave of low pressure that's working its way north of that, and because of that, there's still going to be rain associated with this weather system across southeastern Alaska. That could take us into Thursday and Friday. One thing to note here is, as low pressure is nothing more than a vacuum, it is pulling some of that colder air we saw located across Siberia and northern Alaska and the Chukchi Sea. Some of that's going to kind of sneak its way down into southern Alaska and south central, and if there's still enough moisture around, there's a chance that some of that could be mixed into rain or snow around the Chugach, the Talkeetnas, and we're watching that system develop here. Right now, the signal isn't too clear on snow or rain just yet, but we do know some warmer air will be in place on Wednesday. So if that has any impacts on your travels or your plans, keep watch on the Thursday forecast in south central Alaska. Out across the eastern Aleutians, as well as the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula, periods of rain will still be seen there. We'll watch that rain and snow line start to drift further and further south, but right now it still looks like a large part of the northern Bering will be dealing with rainfall, with snow showers possible across the Brooks Range and the Chukchi Coast, as well as parts of the North Slope as we get into Thursday. Here's a look at current temperatures today. For southeastern Alaska, most areas were in the 40s. They're up around Glacier Bay. Temps were a little bit cooler in the upper 30s. Lower 50s as you get down toward the Dixon entrance. Hyder was 46, Sitka was 48. And 45 up around Haines, Skagway there. As you get into Yakutat, it's 48 degrees, 45 for Cordova, 30s for Valdez today with 48 around Seward, 46 in Homer, 39 for Kenai, and just a hair cooler around Anchorage this afternoon. Talkeetna was 40 degrees on the button. It was 23 in Northway. While up the road in Eagle, it was about 30 degrees, 34 in Fairbanks, Fort Greely 29, cooler in Healy at 26, Fort Yukon was 23. Arctic Village back on the map, and glad to see that observation there. 20 degrees, 9 degrees, Anaktuvuk Pass this afternoon. Low to mid-20s for most of the North Slope as you get down toward Point Lay at 36. Looked like Kivalina was 29 degrees, 27 in Shishmaref, right at the freezing point. For Nome at 32, 29 in Unalakleet. Grayling showed temps in the upper 20s, 29 for McGrath. Lake Iliamna was in the lower 40s late this afternoon. Nunivak Island 31. As you move into Bristol Bay, we saw temps in the 20s and 30s for king salmon. 30s for most of the Alaska Peninsula, including Sand Point at 40 degrees. Even warmer in St. George today at 41. Lower 40s for Adak and Atka and Shemya had 47. Now, overnight low temperatures will be dropping off fairly quickly tonight thanks to the very dry air, and in some cases that reinforcing push of cooler air has already been working through. Teens and 20s for the North Slope, the interior in the lower to mid-teens. A few places like AKwx Pass could go sub-zero. Single digits and teens for most of the Copper River Basin. South Central, including the Susitna Valley, in the 20s and lower 30s, 44 around Kodiak. Lower to mid-40s for most of Southeast. Bristol Bay temps fairly close to freezing. Most places will be just below it. The West Coast also in the teens and 20s. Nunivak Island 31, 34 for St. Lawrence Island. Nome, you're looking at 19 and about 40 for Unalaska and Dutch Harbor, with a high there tomorrow in the upper 40s. South Central in the lower 40s. Kodiak, you're looking at 46. Blustery, wet, and mild for Southeast. 40s and 50s for most areas there. Around Fairbanks, expect a high close to freezing. Low 40s for South Central, as I said, 22 in Fort Yukon. Teens and 20s for the North Slope, and most of the coastal plain will be very close to the mid-teens. In fact, AKwx Pass may only reach 10 tomorrow. In Nome, look for 32. Unalakleet around 30 degrees. And Southwest, Bristol Bay, back in the 30s and 40s. On to flying weather. IFR conditions will advance toward the Chukchi coast as we head into the morning hours. Watch for a pocket of IFR in the Bering Sea, north of the Alaska Peninsula and out across the western Aleutians, and for Haines and Skagway and some of the northern Glacier Bay areas there. You'll expect to start around IFR. That may actually move southward as the day goes on, with MVFR spreading into southeastern Alaska and hanging out over the Gulf as well as Kodiak Island. IFR will continue to sit close to Kotzebue Sound in the western Brooks Range as well as part of the Chukchi coast, and working in advance of the next wave of low pressure in through the west and west central Aleutians. Most of the interior should be okay. AKwx Pass and Adigan Pass, one of those places there. VFR conditions are expected throughout your Wednesday. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass expected to lean over toward VFR as we go throughout the day. Rainy Pass, we expect to see marginal conditions to start the day with improvements to be had. Windy Pass should start out at VFR through most of the day and hold that all the way through Isabel Pass and Mentasta Pass. We expect to see VFR there, and Tanita Pass as well. Portage Pass, look for marginal conditions to start your day with a transition over to VFR. And Chilkoot and White Pass, as we saw, probably holding at IFR, not to mention the wind and turbulence that'll be found in southeast. More on that in a minute. First, freezing levels, and you can see how that colder air is taking over most of the west, southwest, and the interior already. The surface freezing line well south now. The elevated freezing line is around 2,000 to 4,000 feet over Bristol Bay, and you can really see that working its way southward now over southeast Alaska, levels as low as 2,000 to 4,000 feet there. And they're creeping up a little bit out in the west, 4 to as high as 6,000 feet as you move out toward Kiska. Here's a look at the icing potential. Anywhere above 2,000 feet could see some light to isolated moderate across the Chukchi coast out over the western Bering Sea, and we'll be watching the moisture gather across the northern Gulf Coast. Most areas seem to indicate above 5,000 feet for the northern Gulf and northern parts of southeast tomorrow. Again, so far, that looks to be light icing potential for you. The jet stream has several storm tracks associated with it right now. If you can just kind of follow the line, we've got the really cold air working its way through central and western Alaska there. That's taking a dip around the Arctic. Here's our Arctic jet stream, our polar jet. The Pacific jet is working its way much further south of Alaska. This is where all these storms are tracking. The big ones coming up out of the western Pacific, the typhoons, all of those are trying to follow this line right now. And you can see how that kind of splits right here into southeastern Alaska. So only pieces of that storm energy are being brought up into the panhandle, which is probably good news, but we're still getting just a little bit of a piece. Now, as that works northward, that's also grabbing in some of the power of that cold air. So all these things all kind of relate to one another, and it doesn't have to be a perfect setup where one of them is pointed right at your general vicinity to drive some of the stronger weather our way. So interesting stuff. That is a storm track look right now at 9,000 feet. You can see we've got a really broad southerly flow sweeping in across the central and eastern Gulf. 20 to 40 knots working across the eastern Gulf there. Southwesterlies are fairly light across most of the central and western interior, but you look a little bit further north and those north and westerlies are coming right in across the Bering Strait at about 10 to 15. Much stronger winds across the central chain, 45 to 50 knots there, surrounding low pressure on the eastern side and wrapping into the next wave. That's the one that's lining up to move towards southeastern Alaska at 3,000 feet. Southerlies are still in charge of the central and eastern Gulf, 15 to 30 knots there, with south and easterlies fairly light once you cross over the Alaska Range, and very light westerlies working across the Chukchi coast. Northerlies driving through the Bering Strait southward, and low pressure sitting across the central chain, driving west to easterlies about 35 to 40 if you're flying in vicinity of the islands. There, northerlies coming down the west coast about 10 to 15 knots for tomorrow at 3,000 feet. What about turbulence? Well, for most of southwestern Alaska, below 4,000 feet and wrapping into the northern Gulf to about 6,000 feet, you should plan on occasional to even widespread moderate. The worst of the winds and the higher gusts are probably going to be over southeastern Alaska. And I didn't take this as far as draw any isolated severe, but it wouldn't be very surprising with the high wind warning there across the southern outer coast to see that reaching isolated or even occasional severe below 4,000 feet. So hold on to your hats, tie down your wings, and watch out for the waves. We'll cover more in your marine weather here in just a few minutes and have an updated sea ice edge. Stay with us. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, joined again by Eric Stevens from the GINA, or Geographic Information Network of Alaska at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Thanks for joining us again, Eric.
Glad to be here.
Thanks. We are talking about satellites today, and what are satellites? And the easy way to talk about that would be to introduce our friend the globe here, which is a round spheroid type shape. We haven't been on a flat Earth as far as history is known for several hundred years now, and because of that we also know that we are orbiting around other objects in space and that objects are orbiting around the Earth as well. We call all those things satellites in some form or fashion, right, Eric?
Right. Well, this leads to the discussion of Johannes Kepler's research 400 years ago. Did some of the early work and founded the 3 laws of planetary motion, which are important to planets and also to weather satellites.
Okay.
Kepler's first law talks about how the orbit of an object around another object is an ellipse, not necessarily a circle.
Kind of a flattened circle?
Yeah, depending on how flat it could be.
Okay.
For our purposes, we'll just say they're mostly circular.
Okay.
The second law is most important for us, though, and that is the closer an object is to the thing it's orbiting, the faster it goes. So in the solar system, the planet Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. It orbits the sun in 88 days. It moves at 100,000 kilometers an hour.
It is just
moving.
Okay.
Right. And further out from the Earth is Jupiter, and it moves at only 1/4 the speed of Mercury, and it has to go further, so it takes 12 of our years for Jupiter to make one lap. The further out you are, the slower you go.
Okay.
So we're talking about planets. What does it have to do with weather satellites? Turns out Kepler's laws apply to planets orbiting the sun. They also apply to satellites orbiting the Earth.
Okay.
You know, our natural satellite is the moon. There's the famous Apollo 8 Earthrise shot.
Beautiful shot.
Oh, yeah, you could just talk about that forever. December 1968, the moon is about 250,000 miles away from the Earth.
Okay.
Takes a month to go around the Earth. It's that far out, it takes a full month to do an orbit. Another shot here of the International Space Station. Instead of being 250,000 miles out, the ISS is only 250 miles up. It's really close. And so it doesn't take a full month for the space station to go around the Earth. It only takes 90 minutes. It's so close, it just whips right around 90 minutes.
Okay.
So weather satellites, there are a number of weather satellites and there are a number of orbits. The further out you have the satellite, the longer it takes to go around the Earth. And this is important because different satellites have different purposes. So we have a satellite here. This little salt shaker lid will serve as our satellite going around the Earth. Let's say you have a satellite that's 22,000 miles above the Earth. This is kind of a magical spot because at that distance, it takes a full day for the satellite to go around the Earth. Imagine if you put your satellite 22,000 miles up from the equator and had it go with the Earth as the Earth spun.
The same speed.
Right.
Okay.
The satellite goes around the Earth just as fast as the Earth itself is turning. In effect, the satellite will hover in one spot.
Oh, I see.
And it appears when you make a movie loop of picture after picture after picture, you can replay that and you get these movie loops. Geostationary satellites, these are called, because they're stationary in appearance, and they provide a constant frame of reference. We've got an example here. Another nice thing about these satellites, since they're that far out at 22,000 miles, you can see from pole to pole, which is nice. So they're pretty broad view and a constant frame of reference.
So those are the pictures that if you're watching a weather satellite loop on TV, your favorite weather show, that's the picture that you're going to see is one that's sitting over the same spot.
If you're seeing a movie loop play again and again, that came from geostationary satellites.
Okay.
That's the only way you can do that.
Yeah.
The bummer, though, for us in Alaska is we're up on the very top of the planet. And for geostationary satellites to work, they have to be over the equator. So for the geostationary bird to view Alaska, it's kind of like reading a book, but you're reading it edge on like that.
Right.
So there's another kind of orbit called the polar orbit,
Okay.
which is nice. We're near the pole.
Yeah.
And here's a satellite. Those polar orbiters are much closer to the Earth, getting down toward International Space Station elevation. And they're not in the equatorial plane. Rather, their orbital plane is inclined like this. And the Earth turns under that satellite as the satellite orbits. The nice thing about that is for Alaska, the satellite will go right over Alaska a few times a day. And so you get a much closer image. We've got a shot from the Sumi NPP satellite. Specifically, it's a true color image from the VIRS sensor. That's an acronym there.
Okay.
But it's a beautiful shot of Alaska, and you can see so much detail. The kind of detail, because you're close in,
Very high resolution.
you couldn't get this kind of view from geostationary satellites. The advantage of these polar orbiters is nice close imagery. You can see a lot of detail. The disadvantage, though, is that the satellite flies by,
Right.
and then you have to wait a while to get the next image. And if geostationary weaknesses are that you're reading the page like that, the polar orbiter, you're reading the page straight on, but it's so close, and then it zips by, and you have to wait for the satellite to come around the Earth again. So there's no one perfect solution. Different satellites for different orbits, each has their strength, and amazingly, it all comes back to Johannes Kepler and his laws of planetary motion, the same laws that govern how the planets orbit the sun. They govern how the satellites orbit the Earth, and even our little pretend salt shaker right here.
Right, okay. Well, since the 1957 Sputnik, we've been putting man-made objects into orbit around the Earth and starting to get pictures back. Who knows what will happen in the next 50 to 100 years. Amazing
it's
stuff.
a growing science, and the future is bright.
Thank you so much for joining us again, Eric. And for more information on Dehne and what the satellite systems do there and what Eric's been talking about today, you can go to the web address on your screen. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. Always good to have Eric in the studio, and he's got more for us coming up in the next several weeks there. We'll have some new episodes hopefully for you soon. Here's a look at the sea ice edge, weather.gov/Anchorage/ice for the latest information. And if you look carefully, there's a lot of white growing across the northern coastlines, all the way in the nooks and crannies and the bays, all the way around to the Chukchi coast there, as conditions are cold enough for that ice to grow. Not a whole lot of pack ice just yet, but it won't take a whole lot longer for that to kind of freeze up fairly quickly. You can see the concentrations by and large are greatest well to the north of Barrow, but there are some slightly higher concentrations starting to build in north of Barrow at this point. So something to watch, as we all will be across the north slope, and ice is growing along the coast, as you just see. Now, as we look at southeastern Alaska, winds are coming up to at least gale force in some cases, and probably storm force winds there as you get into Clarence Strait and the outer coast of southeast. 45 to 50 knot sustained winds with higher gusts around the 60 knot range in some ways. Again, a high wind warning for Craig and Klawock in the outer southeastern coastline there. Watch for thunderstorms as well. That could be a possibility as we head into tonight and tomorrow. Up north, not quite as strong through the Lynn Canal and Stevens Passage into Fredericks Sound. More of a north and northeasterly flow at 25 to 35, but strong enough. 3 to 7 foot seas there, 10 foot seas in Clarence Strait, 17 to 18 foot seas across the outer coast for Wednesday. Good news is it starts to diminish fairly quickly through the mid and late day hours of Wednesday, and by Thursday, not a bad day. South and southeasterly winds across Clarence Strait, 25 knots there. Still a little choppy. 5 foot seas on the inside, 11 foot seas on the outside. 10 to 11 foot seas from Sitka all the way up toward Icy Cape and Cape around Yakutat. 10 foot seas there with an easterly wind, 25 knots in Lynn Canal. Winds down to 15 knots from the north with a 3 foot sea on Thursday. South central northeasterly winds will be blustery outside of Prince William Sound, 40 knots there. And all the way on either side of Kodiak Island and Shelikof Strait. And you're saying, didn't you say there were storm force winds expected? Yeah, that's tonight. So tonight's winds will be really strong. and then they should diminish, and this will be what you see for most of the day. So winds will be worse tonight and then quickly improving throughout the day. But very gusty winds again through the Barren Islands as well, 35 to 40 knots there. Look for winds to diminish and flip around to more of a northwesterly flow inside of Cook Inlet and Shelikof Strait, 15 to 20 in many areas. And northeast to northerly winds across the western Gulf, still holding up there around 30 knots east of Kodiak Island for Thursday. 10-foot seas expected with light northeasterlies inside of Prince William Sound. It'll still be a little blustery through Bristol Bay and down the Alaska Peninsula Bering Sea coast, 30 to 35, 9 to 13-foot seas there, 10 to 12-foot seas along the Pacific on Wednesday. As we get into Thursday, winds diminish in all areas, 15 to 20 knots with the north and northwesterly flow working across along the Pacific coast, 6 to 7-foot seas, 3 to 5-foot seas from Bristol Bay down the Bering Sea coast as we get into Thursday afternoon. For the Aleutians, southwesterlies already building in the warmth across Adak out towards Shemya, 25 to 30 with 8 to 13-foot seas. A north and westerly wind from Unalaska all the way out toward Nikolsky to Atka, where it becomes a little more southerly there, about 20 to as high as 40-knot winds, though, on that northwesterly flow with seas as high as 13 feet on the southern side of Unalaska and Nikolsky. As we get into Thursday, notice that westerly shift pulling in behind low pressure as it works into the western Gulf. More of a light and variable wind north of Unalaska, still holding on to that 5-foot sea, and northerlies return to the western chain, 30 knots with an 11-foot sea on Thursday. For the west coast, we will start out with north and westerlies coming down stronger as you get into Kuskokwim Delta, as well as the Pribilovs, 20 to 25, 7 to 8-foot seas across the southern Bering. As we get into Thursday, we'll keep northerlies in all areas. The winds really diminish around St. Paul and St. George, 3-foot seas there. Otherwise, 15 to 20 in all areas, 6-foot seas around St. Lawrence Island, 4-foot seas around the Kuskokwim Bay region for your Thursday. And for the North Slope, light winds for most areas there. That helps to encourage that ice to grow, 10 to 15 knots for the Beaufort and 10 to 15 with variable wind flows up and down the coast, 2 to as high as 4-foot seas across the Chukchi coast. And as we get into Thursday, a wind still fairly light across the Beaufort. Once you get to Point Barrow, though, and westward, we'll get into more of a north and westerly wind, 15 to 20 with 6-foot seas there from Cape Lisburne all the way down to Kotzebue Sound. Here's a recap of tonight's weather. A high wind warning is posted for the southern outer coast of southeastern Alaska. There, winds could come up as high as 60 miles per hour. That's for Craig and Klawock, but we do have some stronger gales expected for the region and storm force winds on either side of Kodiak Island, quickly diminishing tomorrow, but the winds will rapidly de-intensify as we go through the daytime Wednesday and into Thursday for southeast. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, sustaining Alaska's pipeline and its operations today and into the future.